At 7:12 a.m., the lobby turnstile clicked like it always did, polite and indifferent, except my badge stayed red and the glass didn't open. I tried once more, slower, the way you do when you want the machine to be wrong instead of your life. At 7:13 a.m., the security guard glanced up from his coffee, then down at the screen, then back at me with a kind of sympathy that never risks itself. "Ms. Langford," he said quietly, like a correction, "it's showing inactive. Inactive. Not denied. Not blocked. Just removed." Behind him, Crown Line's reception wall held the same minimalist slogan it always had: stability through clarity. White letters on slate gray, designed to calm people who move money for a living. At 7:16 a.m., I stepped to the side so the morning crowd could keep flowing past me, and I did what I'd trained myself to do in every crisis. I made it clean. No raised voice, no questions in public, no optics. My phone buzzed at 7:17 a.m. with a calendar invite that hadn't existed the night before. Quick alignment. Conference room 19C. No agenda. No prep. Just a time window and a room made of glass. I didn't have access to the elevator anymore, but the stairs still worked. At 7:24 a.m., I took them up 2 floors, my heels quiet on concrete, one hand holding my tote like it wasn't heavier than usual. Inside that tote was a matte black USB drive, unremarkable, unlabeled, except for a small white strip of tape I'd marked weeks ago with a single word: footnotes. I hadn't meant it dramatically. It was just how my mind filed things, what people said in meetings, and what they admitted in the margins. At 7:31 a.m., I reached the corridor outside 19C. The room was already occupied. 2 people sat inside, facing the door, as if they'd chosen their angles. Darren Klein, SVP of Operations, with the controlled smile of someone who believes his decisions are market forces. Melanie Rusk, HR business partner, with a folder already opened, as if the outcome had happened yesterday. They didn't wave me in. They waited until I stood directly in front of the glass, visible. Then Darren pressed a button. The door unlocked with a soft click. At 7:33 a.m. I stepped in, and the door closed behind me with the sealed hush of expensive glass. "Tessa," Darren said, leaning back slightly, "thanks for joining on short notice." Short notice was the point. Surprise makes people sloppy. It keeps them from asking for time to review. It minimizes exposure. Melanie slid a printed page forward at 7:34 a.m., like it was a courtesy. My name was already on it in bold. "This is a restructure," she said. "A streamline." Streamline. Another word that meant removal, just cleaner. Darren clasped his hands. "We're making some alignment decisions," he said. "The board wants stability, and the truth is, your function has been creating noise." Noise. I'd been head of compliance integration for 2 years. My job wasn't to make people comfortable. My job was to keep Crown Line from becoming a headline. "What kind of noise?" I asked. He smiled slightly at 7:35 a.m., the way leaders do when they want to sound reasonable. "Escalations, friction with ops, the constant documentation." "The documentation is what regulators ask for," I said. Melanie's pen tapped once, delicate and impatient. At 7:36 a.m., she spoke like she was reading from a training module. "This decision is not performance-based. You've done solid work. This is about fit and future direction." Ooh, fit, future direction. Words built to hide responsibility inside fog. Darren leaned forward at 7:37 a.m., lowering his voice like we were sharing a confidence. "Let's be candid. You're rigorous. That's a strength, but it's also becoming visible." Visible. That was the real word. Crown Line was 2 quarters away from a public offering. Every leader here was obsessed with optics. Smooth quarters, clean dashboards, fewer questions. In compliance, fewer questions is the beginning of criminal history. Or at 7:39 a.m., Melanie pointed at the page. "We're offering a standard separation package. 4 months. Health coverage through the end of the quarter. In exchange, we'll need a signature today." Today. Of course. I didn't touch the paper. I didn't look down. At 7:40 a.m., I looked straight at Darren and asked calmly, "Is my system access already terminated?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The badge downstairs had already said yes. At 7:41 a.m., I nodded once, as if acknowledging a forecast. I'll review the terms. Melanie's smile tightened. We'd like to keep this efficient. Efficiency is what you call it, when you don't want scrutiny. At 7:42 a.m., Darren slid a thin envelope toward me. We also need you to return any company property. Laptop, keycard, and anything else you might have. Anything else. The sentence landed gently, but the intention was sharp. They were not just removing me. They were checking what I might take with me. At 7:43 a.m., I placed my tote on the table and opened it slowly, making sure my hands didn't move like guilt. I pulled out my laptop. I pulled out my access card. I pulled out my notebook. Black cover, no logos, the kind professionals use when they don't trust memory. Melanie watched my hands. Darren watched my face. Neither of them watched the matte black USB drive still resting in the inner pocket of my tote, hidden behind a side seam, exactly where I kept it, because I never liked loose objects in my life. At 7:45 a.m., Darren said, "We're going to have security escort you out. Standard process." Standard process. Like shame was a procedure. I stood, collected my empty hands, and said, "Understood." Then I did something they didn't expect. At 7:46 a.m., I thanked them. Not emotionally, not sarcastically, just clean. "Thank you for clarifying the company's direction," I said. Darren blinked. Melanie's pen paused. Because gratitude in that room meant one thing. I wasn't going to argue. Silence is not surrender. It's camouflage. At 7:48 a.m., the door opened, and a young man stepped in with a visitor badge clipped to his jacket. Too new, too eager, trying to look invisible. Quinn Harper, Junior Risk Analyst. I recognized him because he'd asked me questions nobody else bothered to ask. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first. Then he did, briefly. And I saw the conflict there. Loyalty versus survival. Conscience versus rent. At 7:49 a.m., Quinn said quietly, "Ms. Langford, they asked me to witness." I finished for him, gently. He nodded once, almost apologetic. Darren rose as if the meeting needed a conclusion. "We'll keep this tight," he said. "We're minimizing exposure." Of course he said it out loud. At 7:51 a.m., I walked out of the glass room with nothing in my hands and everything in my memory. In the hallway, Quinn followed a half step behind. Not escorting, not leading, just caught in the wake of a decision. At 7:52 a.m., he whispered, so low the walls couldn't keep it, "They're scared of what you found in the reconciliation notes." I didn't stop walking. I didn't look at him. I only said calmly, "Then they should have fixed it." Because some people think removing the witness removes the facts. They forget the facts are already filed. And somewhere in my tote, pressed against fabric and silence, the USB drive labeled footnotes stayed warm from my hand. Small, patient, and precise. Absence is the cleanest form of revenge. At 9:18 a.m., my apartment was too quiet. The kind of quiet that still expects emails. I set my tote on the kitchen table and emptied it with the same order I used at work. Laptop first, notebook second, then the small things that pretend not to matter. Keys, wallet, phone. The matte black USB came last. I didn't plug it in right away. At 9:21 a.m., I washed my hands, slowly, like I was resetting more than muscle memory. When I finally slid the USB into my personal laptop at 9:24 a.m., there was no drama on the screen. Just folders, dates, file names written by someone who expected to come back to them. I opened Q3_recon_drafts. Compliance work doesn't fail loudly. It fails by rounding. At 9:27 a.m., I pulled up the last reconciliation file I'd reviewed before being locked out. The numbers looked right at first glance. Too right. The totals aligned. Variances sat comfortably below materiality thresholds. The dashboards would have loved it. Dashboards always do. I scrolled past the summary and went straight to the footnotes at 9:31 a.m. because that's where people stop paying attention. Footnote 7 referenced a timing adjustment between Crown Line's internal ledger and a third-party clearing partner. A temporary hold, released within the same reporting window. Temporary. That word does a lot of work. At 9:34 a.m., I opened the transaction log behind it. Same hold. Same release. Except the timestamps weren't symmetrical. The release happened before the hold. That shouldn't be possible. Not without manual intervention. At 9:36 a.m., I leaned back and let the silence settle. This wasn't fraud yet. This was something smaller. A crack, not a collapse. Small cracks matter more. They mean someone touched the system. I cross-checked the same footnote across the previous 2 quarters at 9:42 a.m. Same adjustment, same explanation, same language, copied forward like a lullaby. But the amounts grew, incrementally, always just under the threshold that would trigger automatic escalation. At 9:47 a.m., I opened my notebook to a page I'd marked weeks ago with a simple line. Ask why this is always clean. I hadn't asked then. I'd logged it. There's a difference. At 9:51 a.m., my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. Tessa, Quinn said, breath slightly uneven, like he'd rehearsed courage and found it expired. I wasn't sure if I should call. You shouldn't, I said calmly. Which means you should. At 9:53 a.m., he exhaled. They reassigned the reconciliation queue this morning. Darren asked ops to streamline the checks. Streamline again. Always after removal. What changed? I asked. They pulled the manual review flag, Quinn said, for partner settlements. Said it was redundant. Redundant is what you call a control when it catches the wrong thing. At 9:56 a.m., I asked, did anyone document the change? A pause. Then quieter. No. It was verbal. Of course it was. At 9:58 a.m., I told him, don't send me anything, don't screenshot, don't forward. I know, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know. Knowledge is enough at this stage. Evidence comes later. At 10:01 a.m., we hung up, and I went back to the file. I traced the adjustment logic at 10:06 a.m., following it line by line, not for what it did, but for what it avoided. The code bypassed one validation step when a transaction was classified as partner-initiated. Classification is a choice. At 10:11 a.m., I compared the partner list against the client roster. One name appeared more than it should have, always around quarter end, always smoothing the curve. Not a spike, a polish. At 10:15 a.m., I highlighted the rows and copied them into a separate file labeled private_review. No conclusions, just facts. This wasn't theft. It was timing. Revenue wasn't invented. It was relocated. At 10:19 a.m., I closed the laptop and stared at the wall long enough to make the decision without emotion. This wasn't about me being fired. That was optics. This was about someone managing stability by bending time. And the thing about time is, it leaves footprints. At 10:23 a.m., I wrote one sentence in my notebook, underlined once. Find who benefits from the delay. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call a reporter. At 10:26 a.m., I backed up the files, encrypted them, and placed the USB back into my tote. Quietly, precisely. Because the first crack doesn't demand action, it demands patience. At 11:02 a.m., the email arrived without urgency, which is how internal traps are usually delivered. Subject, partner settlement alignment. Q3, close time, 2:30 p.m. Attendees, ops, finance, risk. My name sat near the bottom of the CC list, like a courtesy extended after a decision. I wasn't invited. I was documented. At 11:06 a.m., I read it again, slower. No agenda, no dial-in. Just a room and a time. The kind of meeting where decisions are framed as already agreed upon. I didn't reply. Silence is not surrender. It's camouflage. At 1:47 p.m., I walked into a cafe 3 blocks from Crown Line, ordered black coffee, and chose a table facing the door. Not because I expected anyone, but because habit reveals itself when you're no longer required. At 2:12 p.m., my phone buzzed. Quinn. They moved the meeting, he said, voice low. Room 21B, glass walls. Who's leading? I asked. Darren, he said. Finance is there too. They're talking about reclassifying partner holds as operational timing. Operational timing, a phrase designed to sound like weather. At 2:29 p.m., I closed my notebook and stood. I didn't need to be inside that room. I needed to know how they spoke when I wasn't. At 2:33 p.m., the follow-up email hit my inbox. From Darren Klein. 2. Ops Leadership, Finance, C. Tessa Langford. Aligned on approach. As discussed previously with compliance, we'll proceed with the streamlined release model to minimize exposure and maintain reporting stability. Previously with compliance. That sentence was the trap. It implied consent. It implied awareness. It implied my endorsement. At 2:35 p.m., I forwarded the email to myself, then saved it to the USB under a new folder. Timeline. No response, no correction, not yet. At 2:41 p.m., Quinn texted a single line. They said you were looped in. I was, I typed back. On paper. At 3:04 p.m., I returned home and opened my laptop. I pulled the earlier reconciliation drafts and aligned them against the meeting timestamp. The pattern sharpened when time was applied. Every major adjustment happened after a meeting I wasn't invited to, and was then referenced as having approved. At 3:19 p.m., I opened my notebook and drew a clean line down the page. Left side, what happened? Right side, what was said happened. The gap between them was no longer subtle. At 3:33 p.m., I drafted an email and didn't send it. It would have been easy to object. To say for the record. To demand correction. Easy. And loud. Instead, at 3:41 p.m., I saved the draft as UNSENT_1. Because once you correct the record, you own the outcome. And ownership was exactly what they were trying to assign me. At 4:02 p.m., Quinn called again. They're rolling it out next week, he said. No documentation change, just behavior. Good, I said. Good, he repeated. Yes, I said. Behavior leaves fingerprints. At 4:11 p.m., I closed the laptop and placed the USB back into my tote, resting it beside the notebook like a matched set. They thought the trap was the email. It wasn't. The trap was letting them keep going. At 6:08 a.m., the city outside my window was still undecided about the day. I like that hour. Systems are quiet. People haven't started explaining themselves yet. I didn't open my email. At 6:11 a.m., I opened my notebook instead and turned to a fresh page. I wrote one word at the top, timeline. Silence isn't empty, it's structured. At 6:18 a.m., I drew the first marker. 7:33 a.m., glass room. Separation communicated, access revoked, no adjectives, no feelings, just sequence. At 6:26 a.m., I added the second. 11:02 a.m., meeting notice sent, excluded, CC only, then the third. 2:33 p.m., follow-up email implies prior compliance approval. I paused there longer than necessary. At 6:31 a.m., I underlined the word implies twice. Implication is how responsibility travels without signatures. At 6:37 a.m., I opened my laptop and began aligning files beside the notebook. Logs on the left, emails on the right, calendar metadata below. It looked clinical. It was supposed to. At 6:49 a.m., I matched the system change Quinn mentioned. The removal of the manual review flag against the email timestamp. The change happened 13 minutes after Darren's message. Not before, not during, after. That mattered. At 6:58 a.m., I added another line to the page. 2:46 p.m., control removed. No ticket, no approval trail. Controls don't disappear by accident. They're lifted by people who believe nobody will ask. At 7:06 a.m., I made coffee and let it cool untouched. The goal wasn't speed, it was accuracy. Accuracy survives scrutiny. At 7:14 a.m., I revisited footnote 7. This time, not for what it described, but for what it normalized. Temporary timing variance consistent with partner settlement patterns. Consistent is a dangerous word. It trains readers to stop reading. At 7:21 a.m., I pulled prior disclosures and ran a simple comparison. Same sentence, same placement, same punctuation. The language hadn't evolved with the numbers. That was the second crack. At 7:34 a.m., my phone buzzed. Quinn again. This time he didn't speak right away. "They asked me to update the process doc," he said finally, "but told me not to change the language." "Did they tell you why?" I asked. "They said legal prefers continuity," he said, "for optics." Optics again, always optics. At 7:38 a.m., I said, "Did you update it?" "Yes," he said, "but I saved the original." Good answer. At 7:41 a.m., I didn't ask him to send it. I didn't need to. Metadata exists whether people believe in it or not. At 8:02 a.m., I added another marker to the notebook. Process doc modified. Language static. Behavior altered. This wasn't concealment. It was normalization. At 8:11 a.m., I did the one thing they expected me to do. Nothing. No email, no objection, no legal notice, no LinkedIn update about new opportunities. Silence creates a vacuum. People rush to fill it. At 9:03 a.m., Darren filled it for me. Another email. Same distribution, same tone. As previously aligned with compliance, we are comfortable with the control posture heading into quarter close. Comfortable. A word auditors distrust. At 9:06 a.m., I forwarded it to myself and placed it in timeline, then added a note in the file properties. Second attribution post-termination. Patterns are more persuasive than incidents. At 9:14 a.m., I noticed something else. Small, almost polite. Finance had stopped copying legal. That told me everything I needed to know about their confidence. At 9:27 a.m., I sat back and looked at the page. No accusations, no commentary, just dates, actions, and cause-effect alignment. This is what truth looks like before it's allowed to speak. At 10:02 a.m., Quinn texted one last time. "Should I be worried?" I typed back slowly. "No," I wrote. "You should be precise." At 10:11 a.m., I closed the notebook, slid it beside the USB, and placed both into the tote. The silence had done its job. They were now committed. To the behavior, to the language, and to the assumption that I was gone. And absence, when timed correctly, has weight. At 10:38 a.m., the pivot didn't announce itself. It arrived disguised as routine. An email from an external address, plain font, no branding flourish. Subject Q3 Settlement Review, Preliminary Inquiry. From Helix Advisory Group External Audit. Not a regulator. Not yet. The kind of firm boards hire when they want answers, before questions become obligations. At 10:41 a.m., I didn't open it. I forwarded it to myself, saved it to the USB, and placed the tote back on the chair. Timing matters more than enthusiasm. At 11:07 a.m., Quinn called. "They're asking for historical logs," he said. "Not just summaries, raw." "How are they framing it?" I asked. "Routine assurance," he said. "But Darren looks careful." Careful is what people become when their language stops protecting them. At 11:12 a.m., I opened the email. Helix wasn't asking if controls had changed. They were asking when. They requested system configuration, history, control removal approvals, partner settlement, timing, variance explanations, correspondence evidencing compliance alignment, correspondence. At 11:19 a.m., I smiled once, without warmth. At 11:26 a.m., Darren replied, "All hands calm, all sentences smooth." Happy to support. Compliance was looped throughout. Looped again. At 11:31 a.m., Helix answered with one line. "Please include timestamps." The room shifted without a sound. At 12:04 p.m., Quinn texted a photo. No faces, no screens, just a whiteboard reflected in glass. 3 words written smaller than the rest. Who approved this? At 12:11 p.m., I opened Timeline and added nothing. It didn't need me anymore. At 12:46 p.m., Helix requested a follow-up call with Darren, Finance, and Board Risk. Not compliance. Absence now had mass. At 1:18 p.m., another email surfaced. This one internal. Misfired in urgency. Do we have written confirmation from Tessa? No CC, just panic leaking sideways. At 1:22 p.m., I saved it. At 2:09 p.m., Helix asked for prior quarter disclosures, specifically the footnotes. They had found the language loop. Consistency without explanation is a pattern. Patterns invite excavation. At 2:37 p.m., Darren tried once, just once, to fill the silence. He called. I let it ring. At 2:41 p.m., he left a voicemail, voice still controlled, still reasonable. We may need your help clarifying historical context. Context is what people ask for when evidence stops agreeing with them. At 3:03 p.m., Helix escalated. Board Risk wanted a written summary of control changes post-termination. Post-termination. That phrase does damage. At 3:19 p.m., Quinn texted again. They pulled legal back in, he wrote. Late. Late is better than never, but worse than early. At 4:02 p.m., the board requested Darren's documentation. At 4:18 p.m., Finance revised their language. At 4:31 p.m., the word comfortable disappeared from all correspondence. At 4:44 p.m., Helix asked one final question, copied only to Board Risk. Why was compliance cited after access was revoked? That question didn't need an answer. It needed gravity. I closed the laptop at 5:02 p.m., placed the USB beside the notebook, and waited. Not because I expected contact, but because pivots don't happen in motion. They happen when everything else stops pretending. At 8:14 a.m., the invitation arrived the way serious corrections always do. Polite, brief, and carefully framed. Subject, separation review. Follow-up attendees, Board Risk, legal, external counsel. Optional, Tessa Langford. Optional is a word used when the outcome has already shifted. At 8:21 a.m., I accepted. No comment, no questions. The conference room wasn't glass this time. At 9:02 a.m., it was oak and carpet and muted light, designed to absorb sound and prevent leaks. Helix was already seated. Legal sat straighter than before. Darren was not present. Absence works in more than one direction. At 9:07 a.m., the Board Risk Chair began without preamble. We're reviewing the circumstances around your departure, she said, and certain attributions made afterward. Attributions. The word had finally landed where it belonged. At 9:11 a.m., Helix slid a single page across the table. No charts, no commentary, just a sequence. Termination timestamp, email implying approval, control removal, financial effect, clean, linear, unemotional. At 9:16 a.m., legal cleared their throat. We'd like to clarify that Ms. Langford did not approve the control changes referenced. Clarify, another late word. I didn't nod. I didn't correct. At 9:18 a.m., I waited. At 9:22 a.m., the Board Risk Chair continued. Given the findings, we're revisiting the separation terms to ensure accuracy and fairness. Accuracy. The word I'd been waiting for. They offered a revised package at 9:27 a.m. Extended severance, full vesting acceleration, neutral reference language, written acknowledgement of no compliance failure, no apology, none was needed. At 9:31 a.m. legal added, we'll also be issuing an internal correction regarding prior communications. Correction is what companies do when the record can't be bent anymore. At 9:34 a.m., I spoke for the first time. I don't require attribution, I said, only alignment. Silence followed. Not defensive silence, processing silence. At 9:39 a.m., the chair nodded once. Understood. At 9:42 a.m., Helix closed their folder. Their job was done. At 9:47 a.m., legal asked if I had any additional requests. I didn't ask for names. I didn't ask for consequences. At 9:49 a.m., I asked for one sentence to be added to the record. All post-departure references to compliance approval were inaccurate. They agreed without negotiation. At 9:56 a.m., the meeting ended. No raised voices, no satisfaction, just correction. At 10:03 a.m., I stepped outside. The morning finally decided. The tote felt lighter. Not because it weighed less, but because it no longer carried unresolved things. At 10:11 a.m., Quinn texted. "They're rewriting the process doc." Good, I thought. At 10:14 a.m., I placed the USB and notebook on my desk at home and didn't open either. I wouldn't need them again. Clean exits don't linger. They leave systems intact and exposed to their own gravity. At 6:42 a.m., the building opened without noticing I wasn't coming back. Crown Line's lights rose floor by floor, systems syncing, dashboards refreshing, confidence intact. Absence doesn't announce itself. It tests what remains. At 7:09 a.m., the internal correction memo went live. 2 sentences, carefully neutral. Prior references to compliance approval following Ms. Langford's departure were inaccurate. Controls have since been reviewed and corrected. No names, no blame, just gravity applied to facts. At 7:18 a.m., Ops reinstated the manual review flag. Not loudly, just quietly, back where it had been. At 7:41 a.m., Finance adjusted the quarter-close narrative. Revenue stayed the same. Timing changed. At 8:06 a.m., Legal archived the Helix report under Resolved Matters. The word resolved doing more work than it deserved. At 8:29 a.m., Darren sent his last email on the thread, shorter than usual, stripped of polish. Aligned with board guidance. Alignment had finally found the right direction. At 9:12 a.m., Quinn sat at his desk, updated the process doc, and added one line he hadn't been allowed to write before. All control changes required documented compliance approval. He paused, then saved. No one stopped him. At 9:47 a.m., the system recalculated risk exposure and flagged what it should have flagged all along. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just accurate. At 10:31 a.m., Crown Line's executives moved on to the next meeting, the next quarter, the next word designed to soothe. The story ended where stories like this always end, not with collapse, but with correction. At 11:58 a.m., I deleted the last encrypted backup from my personal drive. At 12:01 p.m., I placed the USB in a drawer and closed it. I didn't need proof anymore. The system had accepted it. At 12:24 p.m., my calendar stayed empty. That was the point. Silence is not surrender. It's camouflage. Absence is the cleanest form of revenge, because when you remove yourself cleanly, the truth has nowhere left to hide. Lessons. 1. Silence is not weakness. It is strategic positioning. In corporate systems, speed reveals intent. Silence preserves leverage. 2. Most corporate wrongdoing isn't criminal. It's procedural. Nothing is stolen. Time is adjusted. Language is softened. Optics are protected. 3. Footnotes matter more than headlines. Dashboards reassure. Footnotes explain. Timestamps remember. 4. When your name is attached without your presence, blame is already being assigned. Attribution is how responsibility moves quietly. 5. Evidence doesn't need advocacy. It needs sequence. Facts gain power when ordered correctly. 6. Real power appears after you leave the room. Presence invites control. Absence invites scrutiny. 7. The cleanest revenge leaves no fingerprints. No confrontation. No collapse. Only correction. 8. Integrity compounds quietly. It doesn't protect you early. It protects the truth later. 9. Absence is the final leverage. When nothing more needs to be said, the system speaks for itself.